Let's pause for a moment and open the door to the past, a world where every event holds a story, and every story invites us to see the world through a new lens. It's the year 789. You're standing on the blustery southern coast of Britain, mist curling around the pebbled shore, the wind tangling in your cloak. The sea, moody and immense, yawns before you, and something strange shimmers on the horizon. At first, you think it's just a trick of light, but as the shapes grow larger, it becomes clear these are ships long and lean with carved dragon heads rising from their prows like hungry gargoyles. You squint. They're moving fast, too fast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere unexpected, I'd love it if you posted your location and local time. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You turn and shout, but your voice is eaten by the wind. In a heartbeat, they land strange men with braided beards and axes longer than your arm. No questions, no greetings, just blood and silver. This isn't a raid from Ireland. These aren't disgruntled locals. These are seaborne strangers who don't care about your king or your customs, and they seem very, very good at this. This first contact isn't technically the famous Lindisfarne raid of 793, but it's a taste of the mayhem to come. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tersely notes the arrival of 3 ships of Northmen and the death of a reeve who went out to greet them. Poor guy probably thought he was just doing his job. Instead, he became the first recorded casualty of the Viking Age in Britain. You're still processing the sheer speed of it all. Their boats seem to glide on water shallow enough to cut up rivers fast enough to outrun most anything, and filled with warriors who laugh as they loot. And this is only the beginning. Viking raids are like unwanted dinner guests who keep bringing friends. One raid leads to 10, then 50, then full-scale invasions. You watch as villages fortify monasteries, start hiding their gold under floorboards, and even sheep seem jumpier than usual. Monks whisper that the world is ending. The signs are clear, they say. Earthquakes, comets, fire from the sky. But it's really just the Norse discovering they like your coastline and your treasure. You try to tell yourself it's just a phase, a storm to ride out. But the raids grow bolder, longer. Entire summers pass with smoke drifting across the horizon, and the names, oh, the names begin to stack up. Hasting Ivar, the boneless Guthrum. Names that sound like something from a bedtime story if bedtime stories involved more beheadings and fewer warm hugs. You learn to fear the sea. Every horizon becomes a question mark. Is it a merchant ship, a fishing crew, or a dragon-headed nightmare coming to burn your home and carry off your livestock? And yet, you can't help but admire the sheer nerve of them. These aren't aimless raiders. They're organized, they're strategic, and they're clearly having a bit of fun. Historians still argue whether early Viking raids were spontaneous or coordinated military campaigns. Some say it was poverty back home. Others blame overpopulation. A few even suggest political exile or the lure of silver-stuffed monasteries. Whatever the reason, you're stuck watching the consequences unfold in real time. A quirky detail you notice: the raiders don't just kill, they sometimes leave behind coins. Not out of kindness, but because they've never seen this kind of currency before. One monk's diary includes a baffled comment about golden discs thrown on the altar. And here's a weird one. One Viking apparently stole a holy relic only to return it later because it gave him nightmares. That's one way to lose sleep over your loot. By now it's clear Britain is a playground for Norse ambition. You start hearing strange languages in port towns. Some of the raiders even stick around. They marry local women, settle down, and open what might generously be called fusion cuisine mead halls. Still, it's a time of dread. You sleep with one eye open, dream of oars dipping rhythmically into black water, and wonder if the world will ever feel safe again. You're in Lindisfarne now, a sleepy little tidal island off the northeast coast, the kind of place where time drifts like sea mist and the loudest sound is the whisper of quills scratching in a scriptorium. Monks pad about in woolen habits tending to chickens and carefully illuminating pages with lapis and gold leaf. Their days revolve around prayers, psalms, and porridge, thrilling stuff. Then, without warning, the sky splits open with screams. It's 7:93, and you unfortunate spectator that you are standing in the middle of what will be remembered for centuries as the beginning of the Viking Age. The longships have landed silently on the low tide. The Norsemen move like shadows between stone walls, stepping over herb gardens and small altars with chilling casualness. They don't knock, they don't ask, they simply enter and unmake. Monks scatter. One clutches a reliquary to his chest like a child holding a toy. Another dives behind a loom. One actually hurls a candle at a Viking. Admirable effort, doesn't work. You flinch as a door crashes open. A figure in chainmail, probably smelling like sea salt sweat and success, drags a silver chalice out of the chapel. Another slices open a leather-bound gospel like it's just packaging for the gold inside. And one pauses curiously to study the intricate carvings on a stone cross. He nods, then smashes it anyway. If you're wondering whether the Vikings targeted Lindisfarne specifically because it was wealthy and defenseless, yes. Yes, they did. The monastery was one of the most sacred sites in Britain, the resting place of St. Cuthbert, and a soft, glittering target. Perfect for plunder. Contemporary chroniclers didn't hold back. One described it as a harrowing of God's church. Another claimed blood flowed like wine. And everyone agreed this was no ordinary raid. This was an omen. Historians still argue whether the brutality was exaggerated for effect after all monks weren't known for journalistic objectivity. But there's little doubt the attack shook Christendom to its core. A quirky side note. One Norse raider reportedly tried to steal Cuthbert's body but dropped it when he thought it spoke. Not screamed, spoke. The story ends with him fleeing the island, vowing to become a fisherman instead. Respectable pivot. Back on the beach, you crouch behind a toppled ox cart. Smoke curls lazily into the evening air. A shattered bell lies half buried in the sand. A sheep bleats in the distance. The Vikings are laughing, really laughing, like they've just pulled off the world's most lucrative prank. And then they're gone. Just like that. They leave no note, no message, no return address. Just ash echoes in a story that will spread like wildfire. The monks are left blinking in disbelief, the survivors mumbling prayers, and the wider world watching with horrified fascination. Word travels fast. From York to Rome, from Frankish courts to Irish abbeys, the tale of Lindisfarne echoes across Europe. Kings bristle, priests weep. Commoners glance nervously at the sea. You begin to sense the shift. This isn't just an isolated act of violence. It's the beginning of a transformation. Britain is now open terrain for a new force. Not just raiders, but storytellers, traders, settlers, dreamers, warriors who'd rather cut your purse than your throat, but are fine with either. And here's the twist: while Lindisfarne horrified the Christian world, it enticed the Norse one. Word of the riches found there, gold relics, manuscripts, slaves spreads through Scandinavia like fire in dry thatch. Suddenly, every coastal boy with a boat dreams of raiding Britain. Not to conquer, not yet, but to get rich. A fringe tidbit for your pillow: some early Norse explorers weren't even warriors. They were traders who figured out that trading after threatening violence was far more efficient than negotiation. A little axe-based bargaining. In response, Britain does what it can. Forts are hastily built, watchtowers erected, coins minted with defensive prayers stamped on them. One king even commissions a fleet, basically Britain's first coast guard, only to lose most of it in bad weather. Not exactly reassuring. Lindisfarne becomes legend. A moment carved into memory like a name into stone. But it's just the start. You lie down that night in a slightly scorched monastery staring at the stars and wondering if this was the opening act. What on earth is coming next? Spoiler: more ships, bigger crews, and very soon, entire armies. You wake to the sound of gulls and the uncomfortable realization that raiding season seems to have become a year-round sport. At first, the attacks were like thunderstorms, loud, scary, and thankfully rare. But now it's as if the clouds never left. The Vikings are back, and they've brought company. It's the early 800s, and what once felt like scattered pirate attacks have transformed into a routine. A grim, noisy, often fiery routine. You travel up the coast through Kent and East Anglia, and no matter where you go, it's the same story. Villagers nervously scan the sea. Monks hurriedly bury their silver under the floorboards of churches that will likely burn anyway. Everyone's got that we've seen this movie before, look, and no one likes the ending. The Norse don't just raid, they build reputations. Some are known for being merciful if paid, others less so. A few even develop brand identities, like a favorite Ragnar hairy breeches. Or Ivar the boneless, yes, really. No one agrees whether it meant he was freakishly flexible or just had a creepy nickname. Historians still argue whether boneless refers to a medical condition, poetic license, or sheer intimidation tactics. But here's the surprising part. These aren't just brute squads smashing things. Many of the raiders carry scales, not for fish for silver, they're calculating. They're here for loot, not leisure. And if you can pay them not to burn your village, well, everyone saves time. One charming example of Viking warband in the 830s actually negotiated a contract with the monastery. Annual payment, no pillaging clause. Essentially the first known protection subscription plan in British history. Still, not everyone agrees to pay, and so the burning continues. A fringe detail of Viking chieftain once sent an English monastery a letter thanking them for their hospitality after raiding them. The letter, written in surprisingly neat Old Norse script, included a sketch of a happy raider waving goodbye. Some think it's a forgery, others just call it peak Viking trolling. You walk through the aftermath of one such raid. The thatch is still smoldering. Someone's holy manuscript lies torn in a mud puddle. A local pig, somehow unharmed, snuffles around the remains of the grain store. And someone carved the rune for wealth into a charred beam. Just in case there's confusion about why this keeps happening. Here's the thing no one tells you despite the chaos people adapt. Life goes on. Markets reopen. Fishermen go back to fishing. Some even begin trading with the Norse between raids. It's a strange, unstable dance hostility and commerce looting and diplomacy swords and silver. The Anglo-Saxon kings try to organize defenses, but they're dealing with a new kind of enemy. These aren't just wandering bands anymore. They're forming alliances, building winter camps, returning to the same regions. Some even marry into local nobility because nothing says I love you like sacking your father-in-law's estate. And slowly the Norse start settling. They build houses, dig wells, hold weddings. One coastal town wakes up to find a Viking baby born in its chapel. They name him Ealdwine, a nice compromise between cultures. You find yourself walking through one of these new hybrid communities. It smells like smoked fish and wood smoke with a side of cultural tension. The Norse and English argue over everything land livestock, even how to build a proper fence. But they also learn from each other. Norse carpenters adopt local building styles. Anglo-Saxon cooks start adding more pickled herring to their stews. Everyone complains, no one stops. By the 850s, the raids have become something stranger occupation. Entire armies arrive not to plunder and run, but to conquer and stay. You hear stories of the Great Heathen Army, a legendary force that lands with ambitions far bigger than gold. One monk writes that they arrived like locusts. Another says they came with more ships than there are fish in the sea. Probably an exaggeration, but you get the point. You peek over a hill and see it for yourself. Hundreds of longships crowding a riverbank warriors, sharpening blades, cooking over fires, laughing like they own the place. Because honestly, they sort of do now. And so you lie back in the grass watching as Britain begins to crack, not all at once, but piece by piece. The coastline is no longer a barrier. It's an invitation. You sigh, this was supposed to be a rainy island with quiet churches and too many sheep. Now it's the hottest real estate in Norse expansion. And they're just getting started. You're standing on a muddy road somewhere in East Anglia, probably ankle-deep in goose droppings, watching a man with a wolfskin cloak stab a stick into the earth and declare, "This is mine now." It's the late 860s and the Norse have stopped playing tourist. This isn't a raid. This isn't a smash and grab. This is a real estate deal Viking style. The Great Heathen Army, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle dramatically calls it, has unpacked, settled in, built fences, and started handing out land like door prizes. You've just witnessed the birth of the Danelaw. The term will come to describe a massive swath of England, stretching from the Thames to the Tees, ruled by Norse laws, customs, and really aggressive beard styles. The English don't so much lose their kingdom as have it overwritten like a scroll, scraped clean for a new text. You watch as towns adopt Norse place names. Everywhere you go you hear, by this and Thorpe that. It's a linguistic invasion that sticks. Even today, you probably live near one. York. Now Jorvik becomes the capital of this strange new realm. You wander through it and it feels oddly alive. There are bakers, glassmakers, even street performers. Norse merchants sell amber and walrus ivory. There's a guy hawking fermented fish in a barrel, no thanks. You realize something peculiar. This is not a land of chaos. It's structured, productive, and weirdly cosmopolitan. Anglo-Saxons and Danes live side by side, occasionally brawling, often trading. One law code suggests that if you kill a man, you can either pay his family in silver or give them 12 cows and a very nice cloak. Justice. A fringe tidbit for you, the Danelaw may have been more democratic than southern England. Local assemblies called things allowed free men to vote on disputes, which makes them oddly progressive if you ignore all the decapitations. Still, it's not all amber necklaces and proto-parliaments. Resistance flares constantly. You pass burned-out farmsteads, abandoned churches, families packed into ox carts heading south to whatever's left of Wessex. And you hear the name Alfred whispered like a prayer or a curse depending on your accent. The English King Alfred of Wessex is refusing to roll over. While the North is being carved up like a boar, at Yule Alfred is building Burr's fortified towns designed to resist Viking attacks. You pass through one and it smells like damp stone and determination. Back in the Danelaw, things aren't always smooth. Tensions bubble. You see one brawl over bread prices escalate into a full-scale street duel. The market clears. Bets are placed. One combatant is dramatically slapped with a fish before swords are drawn. Historians still argue whether the Danelaw was a true government or just an uneasy ceasefire with property rights. But for you walking its muddy lanes and smoky mead halls, it feels like something halfway between a kingdom and a social experiment gone rogue. You pass a Norseman teaching his son how to farm barley in Yorkshire clay. Across the field, an Anglo-Saxon girl mutters something sarcastic in Old English and continues weaving with what looks like impressive passive aggression. It's not love, but it's not war either. It's complicated. And so the Danelaw becomes a strange patchwork of peace and piracy, marriage and mistrust. Some Englishmen convert to paganism. Some Danes become Christians. You attend a wedding where the priest and the gothy Norse priest argue about which god gets credit for the union. They eventually agree on both, probably. It's messy, but it's working. For now. The wind bites harder in Wessex these days. Not because of the weather, though it's reliably miserable, but because Alfred the King you've heard whispered about is officially out of patience. It's the late 870s and the Danelaw may be thriving, but Alfred of Wessex isn't sending any congratulatory mead. He's been busy. Fortifying, plotting, even baking, though you'll soon learn that didn't go particularly well. You find him, in fact, hiding in the swamps. No, really swamps. The great heathen army, still buzzing from its success, has pushed south. Wessex is cornered. Alfred has lost most of his lands, and now he's camped in the marshes of Athelney with a ragtag band of warriors and some very tired livestock. It's damp, cold, and deeply unkingly. You watch as Alfred, disguised as a peasant, is asked by a local woman to watch some cakes baking on the fire. He agrees and promptly burns them. She scolds him. He apologizes. He does not, despite later legend, execute her or blame the cakes for his poor military luck. This bizarre incident will become folklore. Historians still argue whether it even happened, but it sticks because it's very Alfred, humble, steady, oddly domestic, and absolutely determined not to give up. From these marshes, Alfred begins his comeback. You tag along as he rides to gather forces, small fyrds, loyal lords, desperate farmers with pitchforks. He promises protection, unity, and crucially land. People listen. They're tired of running, tired of the flames. And Alfred, for all his low-profile swamp picking, has something the Danes don't envision of one England. He strikes back in 878 at the Battle of Edington. The clash is muddy, frantic, and louder than a tavern at Yule. You duck behind a wagon as shield walls crash, war horns blare, and Alfred leads from the front. For a man recently yelling at overcooked pastries, he's shockingly good at war. Against the odds, Alfred wins. The Danish leader Guthrum surrenders. You expect bloodshed. Instead, Alfred demands baptism. Guthrum agrees. He gets a Christian name Ethelstan and a new god. You attend the baptism and it's weirdly civil. Guthrum even wears a borrowed white tunic which doesn't quite hide the axe strapped to his leg. The peace treaty that follows the Treaty of Wedmore divides England. The south remains Anglo-Saxon. The north stays under Norse control. It's not perfect, but it's the first breath of peace in years. You breathe deeply. It smells like truce and wet sheep. Alfred gets to work not just rebuilding, but reinventing. He orders the translation of Latin texts into English. He standardizes coinage. He reorganizes the military into a system of rotating service, so not everyone has to be on call for Viking swatting duty 24/7. And then there are the burrs. You walk through one and marvel at the grid layout, the ditches, the walls. It's early urban planning designed to keep both invaders and confusion out. Merchants settle in. Bakers bake unburnt cakes. Hope returns. Quirky tidbit: Alfred also designed a kind of portable sundial made of candles. Yes, it melted. No, it didn't catch on. But you've got to admire the effort. He even starts calling himself King of the Anglo-Saxons, a title with ambition. You glance at a map and see it an England not yet whole but dreaming of unity. Not everyone is impressed, though. Some Viking leaders view Alfred's rise with contempt, others with unease. A few just want to go back to trading fur and fermented shark without interruption. Still, the tone shifts. Alfred isn't just surviving, he's building, he's preparing for something bigger. You sit by a hearth in Winchester one night listening to a poet recite verses about Alfred's wisdom, bravery, and cake troubles. Children fall asleep by the fire. Somewhere in the Danelaw, another raid is quietly planned. But the tide just slightly is starting to turn. You wander through the smoky bustle of a town square in Jorvik, formerly York, and realize something peculiar. For a kingdom that was once raided, scorched, and terrified out of its monasteries, England is beginning to look comfortable again. It's the early 900s. The lines are still drawn Wessex to the south, Danelaw to the north, but the rhythm of daily life is shifting. And you lucky insomniac observer that you are get to drift between worlds. Here in the Viking-held north, things are oddly sophisticated. You stroll through narrow lanes lined with timber buildings, past bakers slapping dough, blacksmiths hammering iron, and children shouting in a mix of Old Norse and Old English that sounds like a very aggressive folk song. And the smells, oily fish hearth, smoke sheep manure, and honey. Not delightful, but undeniably real. You pass a stall where a merchant is selling amber beads and walrus tusk combs. Another offers finely carved game pieces made from bone Vikings. Love their board games, especially in a Fatiful, which is like chess if it were designed during a thunderstorm. You peek into a home dirt floor woven wall. Hangings loom in the corner and a family cooking a stew of onions, leeks, and goat. The ceiling's smoky, the kids are barefoot, and someone's muttering about the price of barley. It's medieval middle class. Then you hear something that makes you pause church bells. In the Danelaw, you follow the sound and find a modest stone chapel where Norse converts sing badly in Latin. The priest wears a cross. One congregant wears a hammer of Thor. Nobody mentions it. Everyone just wants to get through Mass and get back to work. Historians still argue whether most Vikings in England genuinely converted or just got baptized to keep the peace. You watch one burly man cross himself, then whisper to a wooden idol in his pocket. The answer seems to be why not both? Here's a fringe tidbit: Norse settlers in England were surprisingly clean. Archaeologists have found tweezers, razors, and even ear spoons in their houses. The Anglo-Saxons, meanwhile, wrote complaints about how these newcomers combed their hair too much and seduced our women. Truly nothing has changed. You drift into the countryside now where Anglo-Saxon and Norse farmers work neighboring plots. There's tension, sure, but also intermarriage, shared festivals, and mutual grumbling about taxes. Everyone agrees on one thing: the king, whichever one is probably taking too much silver. In these blended communities, cultural crossover is constant. Language merges. Clothes adopt the best of both styles. Even funerals mix traditions. You witness one with a Christian priest reading psalms, while the widow slips a small drinking horn into the grave just in case. You fall asleep one night under a thatched roof and dream of mead horns, knitted mittens, and confusing property laws. You wake to roosters and a screaming match over sheep trespassing into oat fields. Very on brand. Down south, Wessex is still buzzing under Alfred's successors. Edward the Elder is on the throne now, and he's picking up where Dad left off. More burrs, more borders, less patience. He builds alliances with Mercia and East Anglia. Yes, that East Anglia, and starts taking pieces of the Danelaw back. Not with fire, but with paperwork diplomacy and the occasional sword. You overhear one Viking landowner mutter, "We used to raid this place. Now we pay rent." You nod sympathetically. Progress is weird. Back in the towns, literacy is spreading again. You see monks scribbling copies of charters. nobles dictating wills, and even a Norse trader trying to learn English phonetically he gives up halfway through Thrimsa. A quirky moment catches your eye, a marriage ceremony between a Saxon woman and a Norseman presided over by both a priest and a man in a bearskin cloak. The ceremony ends in applause, awkward dancing, and a lot of goat stew. Unity is messy, but it's happening. And then you hear the rumble faint at first, but growing the quiet drumbeat of something new. A shift in the balance. The idea that maybe, just maybe, England could become one kingdom again. But don't get ahead of yourself. For now, there are fields to sow, axes to sharpen, and fish to smoke. And somewhere nearby, a child is being born with one Norse parent and one Saxon growing up speaking both tongues and dreaming of something bigger than borderlines. You're in the middle of a village festival and things are getting confusing. One booth is giving out bread blessed by a Christian priest. The next is selling amulets of Thor. Somewhere nearby, someone is yelling about runes and someone else is quoting Psalms. Welcome to the great spiritual identity crisis of Viking Britain. It's the early 900s, and while swords may be quieter these days, there's a new struggle stirring in the heart of every household, which God exactly is in charge here. You find yourself standing at a crossroad literally where a carved Christian cross has been awkwardly added atop an older wooden pillar that still bears Odin's name. It's a visual metaphor, and no one seems quite sure whether to bow, kneel, or just walk briskly past while avoiding eye contact. Religion in Viking Britain isn't black and white. It's gloriously, maddeningly gray. You duck into a Norse longhouse just in time for dinner where the host toasts Jesus and Odin in the same breath before passing the mead horn. His wife rolls her eyes but drinks anyway. Historians still argue whether this kind of dual worship was common or just pragmatic. After all, when you live on a soggy island full of feuding kings, it doesn't hurt to hedge your spiritual bets. Church attendance rises. So does rune carving. The tension isn't always violent, it's more like a low-level sibling rivalry between divine figures. On one side, baptism. On the other, burial with swords. On one side, monks and incense. On the other, bards and bone charms. In some places, compromise wins. You hear of churches built on old pagan holy sites, less out of spite, more out of convenience. Why clear a forest grove when you can just add a few pews and call it Christian? A quirky moment sticks with you in one settlement. A Norseman pays a tithe to the local priest, then asks if that covers him for Valhalla in heaven. The priest stares blankly, probably wondering if that's a heresy or a tax question. You wander further and find yourself at a religious moot. Yes, a meeting about faith, held in a tent that smells strongly of fish and candle wax. Local leaders discuss whether to ban pagan rites. One man protests that without the Yule goat dance, the winter gods get cranky. A compromise is reached, the goat dance stays, but it now celebrates St. Nicholas. Problem solved. There's beauty in the mess. Old Norse sagas get copied by monks. Psalms get sung to Norse melodies. You overhear children reciting the Lord's Prayer while skipping to chants about Freya. One girl insists her doll has been baptized and blood blessed just in case. Of course not. Everyone is amused. Some bishops are furious. Some jarls feel betrayed. A few zealots smash idols or burn churches. But those are outbursts, not norms. Most people are too tired or too hungry to fight over theology. They just want rain in season and fewer taxes. You sit in on a funeral one morning. The deceased is wrapped in cloth laid on a boat carved from oak surrounded by tokens, coins, a comb, a wooden cross, and a tiny Thor hammer. The family lights candles. They sing two songs, one in Latin, one in Old Norse. And then they walk away in silence, leaving the dead to choose their own eternity. Fringe fact 1. Norse burial in England included both Christian and pagan grave goods in a board game, because apparently even the afterlife needs a hobby. Back in town, you find a monk and a skald, basically a Viking poet debating creation myths over ale. The monk insists the world was made by God in 7 days. The skald counters with Ymir's bones and cow milk cosmology. They both agree it's best not to take it all too literally after the second mug. This strange coexistence continues for decades. Slowly, the Christian side gains ground. More Norse leaders convert, some out of belief, some out of political convenience. After all, a king who kneels before Christ is a king more likely to be accepted by the increasingly Christian South. But the old gods don't vanish overnight. They linger in lullabies and charms against toothache in the way a warrior blesses his blade before battle. And when you pass a hearth at night, the stories told still shimmer with magic giants, ravens, and world trees, even if there's a cross hanging just above the fire. It's a chilly morning in a quiet Danelaw village, and you're watching two men argue over a sheep. Not whose sheep, it's clear who owns it. The issue is the sheep's foot. It stepped across a boundary stone sometime during the night, and now someone's oat crop is slightly flattened. The two men shout, gesture wildly, and finally agree to settle it by reciting law codes. Yes, reciting. Welcome to justice in Viking Britain. You might expect Viking law to be all axes and yelling. And sure, there's a bit of that. But the truth is far weirder and much more poetic. The Norse brought with them a complex oral legal tradition. Imagine a courtroom where everyone is their own lawyer, there's no judge, and most of the evidence involves honor goats and how loudly you can speak. That's the thing the Viking assembly. You attend one near a windswept hill, where a circle of freemen gathers to settle disputes, pass laws, and occasionally perform interpretive shouting. There's no gavel, just a large stone, a sacred staff, and several men who take turns quoting verses that sound suspiciously like battle raps from the sagas. The Saxons, meanwhile, prefer writing things down. You see charters, signed oaths, even a proto-filing cabinet made of wax tablets. The two systems don't quite mesh, but both have one goal order in a chaotic world. You hear of a trial in Mercia where a man was found guilty of stealing a chicken and had to pay compensation exactly 3 silver pennies and one public apology delivered in rhyme. It's not clear which part was more humiliating. Historians still argue whether Danelaw justice was more or less violent than Saxon law. On paper, it seems orderly, but then you witness a land dispute that escalates into a formal duel, complete with rules referees and a very enthusiastic crowd. The two men face each other in a ring of spears, bare-chested despite the frost gripping short swords. The winner gets the land. The loser gets carried home on a door. Everyone agrees that justice was served. You nod quietly and reconsider your own property negotiations. Another curious aspect is the weregild, literally man price. If you kill someone, you pay their family. How much depends on their social rank? A churl, a few shillings. A noble, that'll cost you. A king better start digging into your dragon hoard. You pass a house where a woman negotiates compensation for her brother's broken nose. She wants 2 sheep and a bolt of linen. The offender offers 1 sheep and a song. She laughs and takes both. In the markets, contracts are made with handshakes and oaths, sworn on axes or saints. A merchant from Northumbria boasts that his word is as good as 10 scribes. Later, you see him sneakily watering down his mead. Justice, it seems, is a work in progress. Fringe tidbit: one surviving law from the Danelaw says, if someone enters your home unlawfully, you can kill them as long as you shout first. The shout is important. It's like the medieval equivalent of stand your ground, but with more echo. In Wessex, Alfred's legal reforms continue to spread. His laws blend Mosaic commandments, local customs, and good old-fashioned guilt trips. You hear someone quote doom very evenly. Do not doom one doom to the rich, another to the poor. Idealistic, maybe, but it's carved into stone and that counts for something. You watch a town crier announce new royal laws by walking in a circle 3 times and yelling them to the wind. A nearby boy corrects his Latin. The crier throws a turnip at him. Despite the differences between Norse and Saxon justice, there's overlap. Both cultures prize reputation, fairness, and weirdly specific compensations. You read one case where a stolen horse had to be returned, plus a new saddle and 1 week's oats. Very detailed, very effective. Disputes don't always end in violence or fines. Some involve oaths. You witness a trial where a man must swear innocence while holding hot iron. If his hand blisters, he's guilty, if not, miracle. Either way, it makes for dramatic theater. The locals take all of this seriously. Justice isn't abstract, it's daily life. It's who gets to use the well, who owes whom a pig, who insulted whose wife's weaving. It's personal, it's poetic, and sometimes it's downright absurd. Like the man fined for slander because he claimed his neighbor smelled like a troll's armpit. No one knows exactly what that means, but everyone agrees it was uncalled for. As you walk back through the village, you hear the echoes of law being lived out in 100 quiet ways, in gossip and bargains and laughter, after arguments settled with a shared ale. The land may still be contested. The kings may change, but in these muddy paths and candlelit halls, people keep trying to live by rules even if they have to shout them first. You wake up to the clatter of hooves and a messenger shrieking something about a new tax. You rub your eyes, shuffle to the village green, and discover the bad news King Ethelred is in charge again. The nickname the Unready hasn't stuck yet, but give it time. It's the late 10th century, and you're in a realm that's technically unified, relatively Christianized, and legally sound, and yet somehow still feels one gust of wind away from collapsing like a badly stacked hay cart. Ethelred the Unready. Unread in Old English meaning bad counsel, not unprepared, has just inherited the throne. He's young, possibly traumatized, and being advised by men who might think military strategy means wait and panic. And panic indeed is the national sport right now. Because after several quiet decades, the Vikings are back. This time they're from Denmark and Norway, and sometimes from Dublin. You hear names like Olaf Tryggvason and Sweyn Forkbeard being muttered like curses in smoky taverns. These new raids are faster, larger, and disturbingly well-funded. You even hear they've brought siege engines. Siege engines in England. You sit in a coastal village and watch the pattern return like a bad dream. First the sales, then the shouting, then the burning, then the tax collectors. Ah yes, the taxes. Ethelred, desperate to do something, starts paying Danegeld literally Dane money to make the raid stop. Spoiler, they don't stop. Turns out if you give Vikings bags of silver, they don't go home. They buy more ships. Historians still argue whether this strategy was cowardice or pragmatism. On paper, it bought time. In practice, it made England the world's worst-kept piggy bank. One quirky record shows that Ethelred paid 36,000 pounds of silver in a single year. You watch as cartloads of coin are hauled through muddy roads guarded by men who keep nervously checking the tree line. One guard trips and spills a chest. A local child immediately pockets 3 coins and swears eternal loyalty to no one. Even Ethelred's own people grow restless. They mock him in tavern rhymes, scrawl rude poems on church doors, and mutter about curses. You pass a farmer carving "Cursed be the taxman" into a fence post with intense focus. Things unravel quickly. Ethelred tries to patch up the kingdom with alliances. He marries Emma of Normandy, hoping the union will bring French muscle to English shores. Instead, it brings confusing inheritance claims and a brood of future claimants who will make everything worse. Then comes the most baffling move of all St. Brice's Day 1002. You're in Oxford. It's November. Cold, wet, and miserable. Suddenly, without warning, English soldiers begin slaughtering Danish settlers. It's a coordinated purge ordered by Ethelred himself, an attempt to wipe out a threat within. Men, women, children, all caught in the fire. It's horrifying, even by medieval standards. A fringe tidbit decades later, archaeologists will uncover a mass grave in Oxford containing the hacked remains of Danish men and boys. Their bones will still bear the marks of panic, rage, and poor planning. The massacre doesn't deter the Danes, it enrages them, especially Swine Forkbeard, king of Denmark. You watch him raise a fleet cross the sea and begin the real invasion. He's not here to raid, he's here to rule. You flee through towns as Swine advances. Churches are emptied. Villages surrender. Some nobles switch sides before the fighting even starts. Ethelred, ever the strategic genius, flees to Normandy with Emma and the royal children. The King of England has left the building. Sweyn Forkbeard is crowned in London in 1013. Briefly, very briefly, because just a few weeks later he dies. No one knows why. Some say it was illness, others say divine punishment. One particularly strange rumor involves a ghostly monk and a falling crucifix. Historians still argue whether Swine ever truly ruled England, but for a flickering moment the throne was his, and then the power vacuum gapes wide again. Ethelred returns in 1014 like someone who forgot their umbrella. He's welcomed back not with parades but with weary shrugs. You again seems to be the national mood. You overhear a bishop sigh. Maybe we should just let the Vikings have it. Someone throws him a turnip. Through it all, life on the ground continues. You eat soggy bread by a hearth and listen to farmers complain that war ruins the planting season. You see children play king and Viking, where both sides just yell and then take a nap. Justice becomes erratic. Roads fall into disrepair. And yet somewhere in Wessex, a small group of monks continues copying old manuscripts. Because in England, even while it's burning, someone is always writing something down. You sleep uneasily that night. The wind howls. A rooster crows too early. And you wonder, can a country this cursed ever truly recover? It's Christmas 1013 and London is eerily quiet. No snow, just cold drizzle and a thick gray silence you can feel in your lungs. Somewhere a bell tolls dully, but the city streets are empty and the fires burn low. Because while you might expect merriment, or at least mulled something, everyone's a little too distracted by the fact that Swine Forkbeard is now King of England. Well, sort of. You see, Sweyn has technically taken the crown. Yes. He rode into London like he owned the place because he now kind of does and declared himself ruler. The nobles bent the knee, the scribes started scribbling new royal titles, and Ethelred the Unready was last seen backpedaling toward the nearest ship bound for Normandy. But being king and being king are not the same thing. Sweyn is Viking royalty, a veteran of raids battles, and at least one awkward alliance with Scottish mercenaries. He has a strong beard game, a sharp mind, and no patience for English dithering. He sets up camp and gets to work collecting taxes, reorganizing law, and making suggestions about loyalty that sound a lot like threats. You wander into one of his temporary courts, a smoky long hall filled with chainmail scrolls and the vague scent of salted fish, and watch as English lords swear oaths while trying very hard not to look terrified. Sweyn rules for 5 weeks. Yes, you heard that right. Just over a month after seizing the throne, he dies. Suddenly. No wounds, no assassination. Just a sudden expiration that leaves everyone blinking at the throne and saying, well, now what? Historians still argue whether it was illness, heart failure, or divine judgment. One poetic chronicler claimed he was struck down by the vengeance of Saint Edmund, which sounds suspiciously like early PR work from a vengeful monastery. Whatever the cause, it plunges the kingdom into chaos. Again, you trudge through the mud as news spreads. Some say he died in bed. Others claim he choked on a goose bone. One rumor says he touched a church relic he shouldn't have. You overhear a peasant mutter, "First good Viking king we get, and he dies before the pudding sets." That may be the most English response possible. Sweyn's death leaves a power vacuum that's immediately contested. His son Nut is ready to step in, but he's young foreign, and facing a realm that isn't exactly eager to take orders from yet another Dane with an attitude problem. Meanwhile, across the channel, Ethelred dusts himself off, reclaims his favorite cloak, and prepares for a comeback tour. You watch in disbelief as he sails back in 1014, lands in London, and is greeted with something resembling indifference. He promises to rule better, to listen, to not panic quite so much. The nobles, wary of another Viking experiment, agree to give him one more try. Ethelred's return is awkward. Half the country doesn't trust him. The other half actively misses Sweyn and Knut. He doesn't take the news well. Knut raises a fleet. It's fast, big, and filled with men who remember exactly how much silver the English have lying around. You hear the drum beats of war returning again. It's like watching someone patch a leaky roof with cheesecloth. And then Ethelred dies in 1016. Cue another royal scramble. This time the throne goes to Edmund Ironside, Ethelred's son, who lives up to his name by being surprisingly decent at not immediately falling apart. He fights nut tooth and nail well, mostly sword and mud across southern England. You watch as cities change hands like poker chips. They finally meet at the Battle of Asandun. It's a muddy, miserable slugfest. You crouch behind a broken cart as Saxons and Danes scream across a churned-up field. Snut wins barely but respects Edmund enough to offer a compromise. They'll share the kingdom. North to Snut, south to Edmund. It lasts 6 weeks. Edmund dies of wounds or illness, or according to one chronicler with dramatic flair, a knife in the, where while using the royal latrine. Scholars politely skip over that version at dinner parties. Now, finally, Cnut becomes sole king of England. You walk through a very tense court in Winchester, where Danish nobles try to pronounce Anglo-Saxon names without grimacing. Cnut keeps the English legal system mostly intact, marries Queen Emma Ethelred's widow, which is either clever politics or extremely awkward, and begins the work of ruling, not just raiding. Quirky tidbit nut. Issues law codes in English, builds churches and funds monks to pray for the souls of people he almost certainly killed. One charter has him offering gifts of silver and mercy. Heavy on the silver, mercy still optional. And now he sets his eyes on a larger dream uniting England, Denmark, and Norway into one mighty North Sea empire. But don't drift too far ahead just yet. You're still in the warm, uncomfortable glow of one of England's strangest successions. A dead Viking king at Christmas, a returning disaster of a monarch, a boy prince turned warrior, and finally a Danish conqueror who might just keep things together, at least for now. You're aboard a sleek Danish ship now, not because you've been kidnapped, but because you're following Nut the Great, a Viking king who's managed the impossible. He's actually ruling England. And it isn't a disaster. It's the 1020s. The mud hasn't dried from the last 2 decades of warfare, and yet somehow there's peace. Uneasy, fragile, often taxed peace, but peace nonetheless. And at the center of it is Nut seated on a wooden throne draped in wool, hands calloused from sword hilts and governance alike. Knut, unlike his predecessors, doesn't just burn monasteries, he endows them. He doesn't just raid cities, he rebuilds them. And he doesn't write laws in runes or rhymes, he writes in English and, when in a generous mood, Latin. You sit quietly in the back of his court watching as this former raider now listens to land disputes, approves church endowments, and debates with bishops about how many relics count as too many in a single chapel. Answer more than 5 unless one belonged to a martyred pig. But he doesn't stop at England. Knut soon inherits the Danish crown after his brother's death. And just a few years later, he seizes Norway because ruling 2 kingdoms wasn't stressful enough. And with that, the North Sea Empire is born, a triangle of cold, damp dominion, stretching from Winchester to Trondheim. Historians still argue whether this empire was stable or just a well-lit balancing act. One stiff breeze, political or actual, and the whole thing could tumble. But for now, Nut keeps it afloat with diplomacy, taxes, and the occasional axe. You follow him on his royal tour, a practice he adopts to keep his multi-kingdom subjects from forgetting he exists. It involves travel ceremonies and a lot of bread that tastes suspiciously like sawdust. One stop is at Ely Abbey, where Nut listens to monks sing in such perfect harmony that even the guards cry a little. A chronicler later gushes that the king was so moved he donated an entire manor out of pure spiritual joy. Others say he just needed somewhere quiet to sleep. Then there's the famous tale, yes, that tale. Knut, to teach his flattering courtiers a lesson, has his throne placed at the edge of the sea. As the tide rolls in, he commands the waves to halt. They don't. His boots get wet. The message is clear. Only God is king of the sea. Either that or he really hated having damp socks. Scholars still debate if this event actually happened or was medieval PR. Either way, it's one of history's more graceful royal reality checks. And yet, for all the governance and grandeur, Knut is still a Viking under the robes. You see it when he visits Denmark and orders a fleet to enforce tribute, or when he writes to the Pope demanding better behavior from Italian bishops, or when he marries Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, and makes her queen again. Yes, Emma's back, and possibly very confused about the seating chart at family dinners. You hear whispers in court about succession. Knut has sons by different mothers. Harold Harefoot his son by a noblewoman, and Harthacnut his son by Emma. Politics begins its slow, hissing boil beneath the velvet cushions. Still, you can't help but marvel at what he's accomplished. For a while, England thrives. Roads are safer, markets are bustling, even the taxes are sort of predictable. Sort of. Quirky moment, Knut funds the rebuilding of churches in earthquake-struck regions of Italy. Why, no one's sure. Possibly penance. Possibly vacation planning. Possibly he just liked impressing the Pope. You end your evening in London, where merchants trade goods and languages from across the empire. Old Norse, Old English, Frankish dialects. You pass a man selling eels, another trading falcons, and one scribbling a letter home, complaining about too much piety and not enough plunder. That night, you fall asleep in a world where a Viking king bows before the cross, where England's north speaks Danish, and where coins bear the name Knut Rex Anglorum, King of the English, and the Danes, and the Norwegians, and possibly the Scots if they're not too grumpy about it. It's a strange dream, this empire. Powerful, yet brittle. But for now, under Knut's watchful gaze and slightly damp boots, it holds. You're standing at a royal feast in Winchester, somewhere between a platter of roast swan and a monk who smells strongly of fermented turnips, and the atmosphere is uncertain. It's 1035 and Knut is dead. The great North Sea Empire, that shimmering triangle of damp authority stretching from Norway to Wessex, is wobbling. Because holding a kingdom together with charisma, coinage, and a good singing voice is one thing. Holding it together after you're buried in Westminster Abbey is quite another. Cnut's death sets off one of England's messiest custody battles. There's no clear successor. Just Harold Harefoot, his older, probably illegitimate son, and Harthacnut, his younger, definitely legitimate son by Queen Emma of Normandy. It's a classic medieval problem. One son's present but inconvenient, the other's popular but overseas. And guess who's stuck trying to rule while everyone argues? That's right, Harold Harefoot. He's in England. He's got support from nobles in the north. And crucially, Harthacnut is stuck in Denmark, trying to stop Norway from falling off the empire like a badly nailed shelf. So Harold rules provisionally. You attend one of his councils. Everyone's fidgeting, no one says king too loudly, and Harold just wants to be taken seriously. To help, he throws feasts, pardons criminals, and hosts public wrestling matches. You're not sure if this is governance or crowd control, but the people seem entertained. Meanwhile, Emma Queen Widow and professional survivor is not pleased. She refuses to hand over the royal treasure to Harold and holes up in Winchester like a high-stakes game of historical hide-and-seek. She writes to Harthacnut urging him to come over and claim the throne. He writes back busy with Norwegians. Please hold England until further notice. You're not confident this strategy will work. Harold, meanwhile, grows bolder. He declares himself king, drops the regent language, and has coins minted with his face on them. You buy one for a cup of mead and notice it looks like he's winking. Intentional, you'll never know. Historians still argue whether Harold was a capable ruler or just a placeholder in chainmail. But he holds England for 5 years and even pushes Emma out of Winchester. She flees to Bruges. Yes, that Bruges. There's probably a brooding film about it somewhere. Then in 1040, just as Harold is preparing a full coronation ceremony, he dies. Suddenly, no warning, no battle. Just gone. Some say illness, some whisper poison. One scribe blames divine punishment for royal arrogance. You blame bad clams. And so finally Harthacnut arrives. You watch him disembark with a large fleet, an even larger entourage, and the extremely grim expression of a man who's been asked to rule a country he barely remembers. His first move, dig up Harold's corpse and throw it in a marsh. Symbolic, yes. Petty, also yes. Harthacnut tries to rule well, but it's not easy. He's viewed as foreign, aloof, and way too fond of heavy taxes. One of his collectors is killed by a mob in Worcester. In response, Harthacnut burns the town to the ground. PR disaster. Still, there's one flicker of foresight. Perhaps realizing that his health is failing, or that England needs some backup, Harthacnut invites Edward, the exiled son of Ethelred and Emma, back to England. Just to observe governance, of course. Nothing official. You meet Edward briefly. Quiet. Pale. Devout. Awkward in court. Definitely not a Viking. He mostly keeps to himself, mutters prayers, and winces when people yell too loudly. And then, because this is England in the 1040s, Harthacnut collapses during a wedding celebration. One minute he's toasting the bride, the next he's on the floor. He dies with a goblet in his hand and no air. Now what? The nobles look around the room, blink and settle their gaze on Edward, the guy who's been here all of 5 minutes. The son of the long-dead Ethelred, the last Anglo-Saxon male with a plausible claim and 0 ambitions. Congratulations, they say. You're king now. And just like that, Edward the Confessor takes the throne. You sit in the corner of Westminster watching as the Viking Age of Kings ends not with a battle but with a saintly whisper. The empire Nut built splinters. Denmark and Norway drift away. The North Sea Empire becomes a memory, half saga, half eulogy. Quirky tidbit Edward kept a shrine to Cnut in his personal chapel. Historians suspect it was out of respect, or sheer terror that he'd come back. By now, you're wondering what comes next. After decades of raids battles and North Sea politics, England is finally ruled by an Englishman again. But as you close your eyes at night in the firelight of a quiet village, you overhear two nobles whispering. Edward has no children, one says. Then who inherits the crown, the other asks. You sigh. Here we go again. You're watching a king pray. Not fight, not feast, not argue over land, but kneel silently for hours, eyes closed, lips moving in gentle rhythm. Welcome to the reign of Edward the Confessor, a monarch who'd rather fast than fight, and would probably choose a hermitage over a crown if given the option. It's the 1050s and England is on the surface peaceful. The Vikings are gone. The taxes have stabilized. There's no foreign army docking on the coast for once. And Edward is on the throne wearing a soft expression and an itchy crown that he rarely seems to enjoy. But you've seen enough history by now to know that quiet doesn't always mean calm. Edward, born in exile and raised in Normandy, rules like a ghost at his own banquet. He's tall, mild-mannered, fluent in both Old English and Old Norman, and has the curious ability to disappear in the middle of arguments without anyone noticing. He's also deeply religious, so much so that people start whispering that he performs miracles. One story claims he healed a blind man with a simple touch. Another that he blessed bread and cured a whole village's toothache. Skeptics roll their eyes. Devotees build shrines. Historians still argue whether Edward was holy or just unusually introverted. But as you walk through Westminster, you notice something strange. Edward isn't really ruling. That job quietly, powerfully is being done by Earl Godwin and his sprawling, dangerously ambitious family. Godwin is the real power behind the throne. A former favorite of Cnut, now the patriarch of the most powerful noble house in England. His sons, especially the tall, charismatic Harold Godwinson, hold key earldoms. Wessex, East Anglia. Practically everything south of the Danelaw. You attend a feast at Godwin's estate, and it feels more like a coronation than a dinner. Peacocks roasted with cloves. Gold goblets overflowing with mead. Servants tiptoe nervously. Harold tells a joke. Everyone laughs. Edward, seated at the far end, does not. There's tension here, royal, political, and deeply personal. A few years ago, Edward exiled Godwin and his entire family after a quarrel over Norman influence, and a messy incident involving townsfolk and soldiers. But Godwin returned with an army, and Edward, rather than fight, forgave him. Because of course he did. You get the sense that Edward isn't afraid of Godwin. He's simply over it. He focuses instead on building Westminster Abbey, a colossal church project that he funds with enthusiasm and questionable accounting. You walk through the half-built structure watching masons mutter prayers between hammer strikes. It's stunning and slightly drafty. A quirky side note, Edward apparently hated women's jewelry. He once banned a courtier's wife from wearing pearls near him, possibly because they reminded him of vanity. Or maybe he was just allergic to drama. Meanwhile, trouble brews overseas. In Normandy, Duke William Edward's cousin, through Emma, is watching England very closely. Some say Edward once promised William the throne. Others say it was a rumor spread by Norman scribes with excellent imaginations and a talent for propaganda. Either way, William believes it. And here's where things start to fray. Edward has no children, no obvious heir. He seems content to let God sort it out. But you and everyone else can see what's coming, a succession crisis the size of a mead hall brawl. In 1064, Harold Godwinson sails to Normandy. Why exactly is debated. Some say it was to negotiate the release of hostages. Others claim he went to confirm Edward's succession plans. Either way, he ends up in William's court, where things get complicated. You weren't there, but you hear stories that Harold was treated well, that he was given gifts, that he was asked to swear an oath, possibly on a chest of holy relics, that he would support William's claim to the throne. Harold, being Harold, nods politely and probably fingers crossed under the table. Historians still argue over the exact terms of the oath. Was it binding? Was it coerced? Was Harold simply trying to avoid being tossed in a Norman dungeon? Either way, the stage is now set. Quietly, dangerously. Back in England, Edward's health begins to fail. You see him less in court, more in chapel. His robes grow looser. His appetite fades. But his abbey nears completion. By Christmas 1065, the building is ready. Westminster Abbey is consecrated in a grand, incense-choked ceremony. Choirs sing, bells ring, pilgrims weep. It's Edward's final gift to a kingdom that never quite understood him. He dies just days later, and now suddenly everything is up for grabs. The nobles meet. The crown is passed not to a Norman, not to a distant cousin, but to the man everyone expected, feared, and maybe even admired, Harold Godwinson. He's crowned the very next day. Some say it was rushed, others say it was smart. You watch as he ascends the throne in Westminster Abbey beneath the same arches Edward built, wearing a crown that still smells like myrrh and worry. But out across the sea, Duke William clenches his jaw, and far to the north, another man sharpens his sword. The year is 1066, and England is about to enter the most sleep-depriving chapter in its entire medieval history. You, however, are just trying to enjoy your morning porridge without the sky falling. Too bad, because it's not falling, it's thundering, with hoofbeats, with oaths, with war. Harold Godwinson is king. Crowned hastily the day after Edward the Confessor's death, he sits on the throne with a wary stare and a beard that's probably going to gray prematurely. The coronation is quick, the celebration quieter than usual, because Harold knows something you know too. He has about 3 enemies too many. First, there's Duke William of Normandy fuming across the Channel, clutching an alleged promise from Edward and that famous oath Harold supposedly swore. William isn't known for patience. He's known for planning, and right now he's building ships, lots of them. Second, there's King Harald Hardrada of Norway, the last great Viking. 7 feet of muscle, fury, and drama, he believes he has a claim to the English throne via an old agreement no one remembers signing. But he remembers. And he's bringing 10,000 of his closest friends to prove it. Third, there's Tostig, Harold's own brother. Recently exiled, currently very bitter, and now teaming up with Harold Hardrada like a medieval version of enemy of my enemy. You follow Harold as he scrambles to prepare. He marches along the coast raising troops, repairing beacons, and generally looking like a man who hasn't slept in weeks. The south of England braces for invasion, but the winds are on Harold's side for now. Then comes September, and the north explodes. Harold Hardrada lands near York with his Viking fleet, a forest of mass, a mountain of mail, and an ego large enough to block the sun. Tostig joins him probably with a smug grin and a lot of emotional baggage. They win a quick battle at Fulford, York surrenders, the north looks lost. But then, like a figure from a saga, Harold marches north 200 miles in just 4 days. His army is exhausted, soaked, and probably running on bread crusts and adrenaline. But they arrive at Stamford Bridge before Hardrada even knows they're coming. And what happens next is legendary. You find a perch on a muddy ridge and watch as the Viking army lounges by the river, helmets off, shields down. They expected hostages. They get Harold's entire army. The English charge. The Vikings scramble. A lone Norseman holds the narrow bridge for hours, wielding a double-bladed axe and shouting poetic insults until, according to one account, he's stabbed from below by a sneaky soldier in a barrel. Historians still argue whether that detail's true, but everyone agrees the Battle of Stamford Bridge is brutal. Harold Hardrada is killed. Arrow through the throat, his famous last words. Possibly we won't be going home with many men delivered in a tone of grim understatement. Tostig dies too, probably still angry. It's a massive victory, but it comes just in time for the worst news imaginable. William has landed. On the south coast, with knights, archers, siege engines, and maybe a slight smirk. You pivot with Harold again. He marches back down south. 200 miles again. The army is tired. The roads are muddy. The blisters are probably sentient, but there's no choice. William is digging in near Hastings, and he's brought papal approval, a holy banner fluttering over the Norman tents like divine Yelp stars. You arrive at Senlac Hill October 14th, 1066. The English form a shield wall, a bristling, snarling wall of spears and grit. You squeeze into the rear ranks trying to look useful. Harold's at the center, standard flying brothers beside him, face drawn, but resolute. The Normans attack uphill once, twice again. They're repelled each time. You start to believe this might work. Then comes the feigned retreat. Norman cavalry turns and runs, luring part of the English force downhill. When they break formation, the Normans spin around and cut them down. The battle seesaws for hours. Then late in the day, an arrow arcs through the air. It descends, time slows, and hits Harold. In the eye. Or maybe not. Historians still argue whether the famous eye wound image is real symbolic or just medieval artistic flair. But what's clear is this Harold falls. The shield wall collapses. The English scatter. Night falls? The field is silent except for the groans of the dying and the whisper of a new era approaching. William, Duke of Normandy, is now William the Conqueror. England will never be the same. Quirky detail: the Normans bring cheese to their victory feast. English soldiers grumble about it for decades. You sleep that night near a burned-out hut listening to unfamiliar French voices and the clink of Norman armor. The last true Anglo-Saxon king is dead. The last great Viking has fallen. The game has changed. But as always in England, the stories are just getting started. The battlefield is quiet now. You stand on the slopes of Senlac Hill where just yesterday steel met flesh and kings fell. Now it's just wind smoke and the flutter of a torn standard half buried in the churned-up earth. Crows hop through the grass. A helmet catches the sunlight. You don't breathe too loudly. It's late 1066. William has won. But conquest isn't a finishing line, it's a to-do list. And William, Duke of Normandy, now King of England, is holding the world's most delicate plate of political leftovers. His army is foreign. His language is foreign. His gods aren't different, but his bishops certainly are. And the English, well, they're not thrilled. You follow William as he begins to secure the realm, carefully, relentlessly. First, he moves toward London, but it's tense. The city's not interested in another foreign king, so he bypasses it. Crosses the Thames. Starts burning towns on the approach. Subtle. The city bends. You're in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066 when William is crowned. It's cold, the incense is thick, and half the Norman guards panic when the congregation cheers thinking it's a rebellion. They draw swords. Someone screams. Merry Christmas. William is crowned Rex Anglorum, King of the English. He's wearing English regalia, swearing oaths in English and French, and probably wondering why everything smells faintly of wet sheep. And then the real work begins. You watch as Norman castles rise across the countryside. They're fast, brutal symbols of dominance, motte and bailey fortresses with wooden towers, ditches, and walls taller than any Englishman has seen before. They're like mushrooms after rain. Defensive mushrooms. Everywhere you go, York, Exeter, Nottingham, you see the same cycle: resistance, suppression, construction. William sends trusted Norman barons to manage the land. The Anglo-Saxon nobility is either stripped of titles dead or politely shoved into monasteries. Resistance flickers. In the north, it flares. You travel with William during the Harrying of the North, a winter campaign so destructive, it makes the Vikings look like underachievers. Villages are burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered. The land itself is broken, not just the people. Historians still argue whether this was a military necessity or an act of genocide. Either way, you walk through the frostbitten ashes of Yorkshire and hear only silence. Even the wind feels ashamed. Meanwhile, language begins to fracture. You listen as court documents start appearing in Latin land deeds in French, and market arguments still happen in Old English. It's like the Tower of Babel, but with more tax records. Quirky fact. The word beef comes from the French boeuf and cow from the English quow. Why? Because the French-speaking Normans ate it, and the English-speaking peasants raised it. That's dinner and social commentary all in one. You peek into royal councils where Norman lords squabble over who gets which estate, and English scribes try not to sigh too loudly. Emma the old queen is long gone. So is Harold. Even Edward the Confessor is fading into sainthood. To cement control, William orders something unprecedented, a complete inventory of his new kingdom. You find yourself watching a scribe squint over a very long scroll. The Domesday Book. It lists every field mill, pig, and peasant. It's part census, part tax document, part very obsessive shopping list, and once it's written, it's law. No arguing with Domesday. The Norman elite becomes a new ruling class. Old Anglo-Saxon names vanish from court. The Anglo-Norman world is born French lords, English laws, Latin prayers. You attend a wedding where the bride speaks only Old English and the groom only Norman French. They nod politely and agree on bread. But not all is grim. Trade revives. Churches are rebuilt, and Westminster Abbey, finished by Edward the Confessor, becomes the beating heart of royal ritual. You stand beside its stone walls and think this is where it all changed. And maybe, just maybe, where it will hold. You hear whispers of distant plots. Welsh uprisings, Danish raiders reconsidering retirement. But for now, William holds firm. Yet even William is mortal. You watch him in his later years thicker around the middle, suspicious of everyone constantly scanning maps. In 1087, after falling from his horse during a campaign in France, he dies rumored to have burst from the pressure of his armor. His funeral is awkward. The church he's to be buried in is too small for his body. They try to force him in. The sarcophagus cracks. The crowd murmurs. A peasant steps forward and demands payment for the burial land. History has a way of staying petty, and so ends the reign of William the Conqueror. He leaves behind 3 sons, several wars, and a permanently changed England. The Vikings may be gone, but their ghosts linger in place names and bloodlines in the edge of every sword. You lie down that night under a Norman roof listening to an English lullaby sung by a nurse with a French name. You don't know the next king yet, but you know this England will never be Anglo-Saxon again. You're seated on a wooden bench in a sun-dappled courtyard, eavesdropping on a scribe muttering to himself in 3 different languages. Latin, Old English, and Norman French, just to get a sentence right. Welcome to post-conquest England, where everyone's confused. Everything is changing, and somehow the goats still get fed on time. It's the late 11th century. William the Conqueror is dead, but his legacy is very much alive, and so are his sons, which is a bit of a problem. England, you see, isn't just a kingdom anymore. It's a family heirloom. And William had 3 boys, Robert, William, Rufus, and Henry. Like a trio of badly matched chess pieces, they each want a different corner of the board. Robert gets Normandy, William Rufus gets England, Henry gets a large purse of coins and awkward glances. You watch the new king, William II. Rufus, called Rufus for his red hair, tried to fit into his father's boots. He rules from Winchester and Westminster, but not quite with the same iron discipline. He's brash, bold, loud, and occasionally terrible at making friends. One chronicler calls him a man who feared neither God nor man. Another says he preferred jesters to bishops. You watch him argue with churchmen, tax nobles, and decorate his court like a tavern with better chairs. The church is not impressed. In fact, William Rufus spends much of his reign arguing with Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a gentle, pious man who looks like he wants to be anywhere else. They quarrel over clerical appointments taxes and whether or not it's okay to leave bishops unordained for years if you're busy building hunting lodges. Historians still argue whether Rufus was a misunderstood administrator or a petulant tyrant with a sword collection and zero chill. Then rather suddenly he dies. In 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, William is struck in the chest by an arrow. No one knows who shot it. The culprit vanishes. Some say it was an accident. Others mutter about assassination. You look sideways at his brother Henry, who gallops off suspiciously quickly to seize the treasury. Henry becomes Henry the Friend, crowned in a hurry at Westminster, while Rufus's body still lies in state awkwardly and reportedly with some bloating. Nothing says succession crisis like a funeral no one wants to attend. You follow Henry into the 12th century and find a man who's actually competent. He's clever, cold, efficient. He marries Matilda of Scotland, uniting Norman rule with old Anglo-Saxon bloodlines, a PR masterstroke. The people still grieving the good old days of Edward the Confessor love it. You overhear one merchant sigh, "Feels like the old ways again, but with more paperwork." Henry isn't flashy, but he's sharp. He reforms the court system, regularizes taxes, introduces the exchequer, a kind of medieval calculator meets chessboard for royal revenues. You peek into the room where men push counters across a grid, while muttering sums it looks both sacred and stressful. Quirky tidbit: Henry reportedly read Latin. Not bad for a king with a dozen illegitimate children and a fondness for boar pie. But even Henry can't escape the curse of the crown. His only legitimate son, William Etheling, drowns in 1120 when the White Ship sinks in the English Channel. It's a disaster. The heir, along with half the young nobility, vanishes into the sea in one drunken night. Henry is shattered. The succession is shattered. The realm starts to shudder. You watch as he forces his barons, grumbling, swearing to accept his daughter Matilda as heir. A woman, a former empress, and very, very determined. But when Henry dies in 1135 from eating too many lampreys, according to legend, the nobles do what they always do when left unsupervised: ignore everything. They crown Henry's nephew Stephen of Blois. And just like that, England plunges into what one chronicler calls 19 long winters. You travel through the countryside and see it firsthand. Lawlessness burned out churches, nobles, building their own castles without permission. It's a Game of Thrones, but with more mud and significantly worse hygiene. Stephen and Matilda clash. Castles are sieged. Towns are taken lost, then taken again. You hear stories of Christ and his saints sleeping, which is medieval code for everything is on fire. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, will succeed Stephen. You exhale. The Norman grip on England is still tight. But underneath it, the lines are blurring. French and English languages are starting to blend. Anglo-Saxon traditions quietly persist in fields, songs, and bedtime stories. Viking names still linger on maps. Old gods fade, but echoes remain. And you realize this is post-Viking Britain. The land has changed, the rulers have changed, but the soil remembers. Every village name with Byre Thorpe hums with Norse memory. Every trial, every coin, every oath carries traces of raiders turned rulers. You lie down by a crumbling Roman wall under a sky full of stars and questions. What comes next is Plantagenets, crusades, Magna Carta, plagues, and peasants. But tonight you rest in a kingdom once built with fire and axe, now ruled by scroll and seal. You're seated beneath the rafters of a weather-worn hall in northern England, listening to the wind moan like an old Norse ghost. Outside, the moors are damp, the sheep are damp, and honestly, even the trees seem a bit tired. It's the late 12th century, and the scars of conquest still linger. But now they've started to blend into the landscape like moss on old stone. The Normans have ruled England for over 100 years. Their French has softened. Their towers have settled. Their swords rest more often than not. And yet, the Viking presence hasn't vanished. It's just gone quiet, moved into the wallpaper of history. You see it most clearly in place names. Everywhere you go, Grimsby, Derby, Scunthorpe, Whitby, you're walking through Norse grammar. By means farmstead. Thorpe means village. These aren't just leftovers, they're living etymology. Even now, when a shepherd calls for his dog in the dales, you can hear the echo of a long ship in his voice. Even the legal system hasn't fully shaken its Danish influences. In parts of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, Danelaw customs still flavor how land is measured, inherited, and taxed. You watch a reeve tally fines using carved sticks, a system the Normans initially mocked and then quietly adopted. Sometimes practical things survive even empire. A fringe fact for your fireside: England's trial by jury may have roots in both Anglo-Saxon oath-swearing and Norse thing assemblies. So next time you see a jury summons, you can thank a Viking and a Saxon for the paperwork. And the language, it's mutating. You listen to market chatter and hear something strange, a blend of Anglo-Saxon, Norman French, and Norse. Words like skyknife egg window and freckle all Norse. The English language is becoming a mongrel, beautiful, blunt, wildly flexible, like a shield wall built out of borrowed planks. Even folklore refuses to forget. You stop in a village where the locals still whisper about giants that smell of seawater and trolls in the fens. A grandmother tells you a bedtime story about a ghost Viking whose axe appears on stormy nights. You ask her if it's true. She shrugs and says, "Doesn't matter, still keeps the boys out of the woods." You pass stone crosses carved with both Christian and Norse motifs. A Christ figure flanked by dragons. A cross whose arms end in serpents. Paganism may be dead, but like a good haunting, it refuses to leave entirely. And then there's the rebellion. In the 12th century, uprisings occasionally flare in the north, places once heavily settled by Norse immigrants. The harrying of the North is a century old, but the bitterness still lingers. You hear old men curse Norman names under their breath. You see children throwing stones at tacksmen who speak with southern accents. Historians still argue whether these resentments are cultural memory or just northern stubbornness. You suspect it's both. But something curious is happening too. Integration. By now, intermarriage between Norman Saxons and Old Norse families has woven a complicated tapestry. You attend a wedding where the bride's name is Edith and the groom's name is Thorkel. The priest blesses them in Latin. The uncle makes a toast in a Yorkshire accent that could strip paint. Even the church, once suspicious of Norse paganism, now claims some of its relics. You visit a cathedral where a Viking sword lies beside a saint's finger bone. Pilgrims kiss both. You're not sure which has more spiritual clout. In Orkney, Shetland, and parts of Scotland, Norse culture survives more vividly. You meet farmers who still tell stories of Odin alongside Saint Olaf, their dialects heavy with Norse vowels. A boy shows you a rune carved into a boat oar. You ask who made it. He says, "My grandfather," for luck. Even the Normans themselves, those once French conquerors, descended from Norsemen. Norman comes from Northman. So, in a strange historical loop, the conquerors of 1066 were in a sense Vikings with better table manners. Quirky side note. One 13th century English noble tried to trace his family tree back to a great sea king named Ulf. When his cousin asked if that was true, he simply replied, "Sounds impressive, doesn't it? You stroll through the lanes of York and notice that half the local customs still involve feast ale and arguing over sheep prices, all very Norse hobbies. You realize the conquest didn't erase the Viking layer. It absorbed it. And you still trailing this strange land's footsteps begin to understand. The Viking story in Britain doesn't end with an arrow or a treaty. It fades in. It sinks into the culture like ink on vellum faint, but permanent. Not gone. Just normal. That night in a cottage warmed by peat smoke, you hear a lullaby in a half-familiar tongue. Outside, a cold star glitters like a Norse pendant lost in the sky. The longships are gone, but their wake still ripples. It's been generations since a Viking army last set foot on English soil, and yet as you step into the misty hills of northern England, you can't shake the feeling that something ancient is watching from behind the stones. We're deep into the 13th century now, and while the royal court is busy with legal reforms and crusade talk here in the quiet parts of Northumbria and Cumbria, the air still carries Norse echoes, sometimes in rebellion, sometimes in rhyme, and sometimes in silence. You arrive in Durham, a place once ransacked by Norse raiders, now revered for its soaring cathedral and the shrine of St. Cuthbert. But even this place wrapped in incense and monkish muttering has its secrets. Locals tell you about ghost sightings. A pale warrior with a serpent on his shield, glimpsed by moonlight along the riverbank. A spectral ship that sails over dewy fields. Old Viking bones, they say. Some don't stay buried. You smile politely. But then you hear it again in a different village by a different fire. The same stories, different names. The legends have merged with the land. Then there are the rebellions. Even in the so-called settled regions, unrest simmers. The harrying of the north may be 2 centuries gone, but resentment still haunts the valleys. The northern barons, many with Viking ancestry, don't always follow the king's plans. In 1215, when King John signs the Magna Carta, he does so under pressure from these very men. One of them, Eustace de Vesci, traces his line back to Norse settlers. You overhear a drunken priest complain that the blood of pagans still churns in Parliament. Quirky footnote. In some Yorkshire villages, the May Day celebrations still involve mock sword fights, horned masks, and boats made from wicker. The church tries to call it symbolic. The locals wink and say it's just the old ways. You head west toward Cumbria and notice how place names shift Ulverston, Gosforth, Thursby, each one a whispered fragment of Norse memory. You pause at a standing stone etched with a Viking-style cross. Local legend says it was once the staff of a sea giant turned to stone. A shepherd adds that the giant still wakes when the thunder rolls. In Orkney and Shetland, the Norse presence is even stronger. You take a boat north and land in a world that still speaks a different rhythm. The Norn language, a Scandinavian tongue, is fading but not gone. You hear it in lullabies and curses and in the names of fishing tools. And the stories. In a stone cottage, a storyteller named Inga tells you about the trow, mischievous fairy folk said to descend from those who hid when Christianity came. Vikings, she whispers, who forgot to leave. You shiver slightly and pull your cloak tighter. Historians still argue whether these lingering myths are holdovers from Norse times or medieval reinventions. Either way, they stick, especially in the dark. Back on the mainland, you pass through a forest near Lancaster where children are playing a game called Raiders. One team shouts in nonsense Norse. The other builds a monastery out of sticks and pretends to hide treasure. No one taught them the rules. It just evolved. You find yourself at a folkmoot, a kind of village council where disputes are settled by vote and shouting. No kings, no swords, just elders in wool cloaks arguing over grazing rights. Our grandfathers did it this way, they say, and their grandfathers before them. Sounds awfully familiar, and all the while the landscape speaks. The Danelaw has long been absorbed. The kings now speak French-tinged English, but the shape of life in the north, the patterns of settlement, the rhythms of work, the names carved into stones, all still hum with Norse DNA. You pass an old man carving a rune into his walking stick. For luck, he mutters. You ask him what it means. He shrugs. It's just what we do. And then one evening, under a sky streaked with orange mist, you sit on a hill overlooking the river Ouse. Below you, a flock of sheep winds along a path trodden for 1,000 years. Somewhere beyond the hills, a bell tolls for vespers. And for just a moment, it feels like you've slipped between centuries. The Vikings are gone, but they're still here. In bone, in word, in shadow. They're not raiding anymore. They're remembered. You're standing at the edge of a stone pier in the Orkney Islands, the sea restless under a sky the color of old pewter. It smells of salt kelp and something older, something that doesn't quite have a name. You're here to witness the last flickers of Norse rule in the far corners of Britain. A history that, even as the rest of England marches toward castles and crusades, still hums in the islands and ports. Welcome to the last Norse holds. We're now in the 13th and 14th centuries. And while England has been officially free of Viking invasions for centuries, not everyone has gotten the memo. On the western edges in places like Orkney Shetland, the Isle of Man, and even Dublin Norse, rural Norse culture and Norse bloodlines persist like stubborn moss on an old stone roof. Start in Orkney, once ruled by earls who paid homage to both Norwegian kings and Scottish ones depending on the wind. These islands are a curious hybrid of Scandinavian grit and Gaelic poetry. You walk into a church made from ship timbers. The priest speaks Latin. The congregation still whispers blessings to Odin when the tide rises too quickly. The Orkneyinga saga, written in Iceland but full of blood-drenched tales from here, tells you everything you need to know. Heroes who swear vengeance, earls who raid neighbors over sheep, sword duels at sunrise, but also farming, a lot of farming. You wander into a stone house and find rune-inscribed spoon's bone combs and a wooden cross carved with dragon heads. A woman serves you fish stew and says my grandmother used to call Sundays Suna Dagur. You nod. That's the old Norse name for it. And it's still hanging on. Then you sail south, to the Isle of Man where the Norse-Gaelic fusion is so complete, it might as well be its own culture. The locals elect their rulers at Tinwald Hill, an open-air parliament, with roots in Viking things assemblies where free men debated laws and settled disputes. It's still functioning. And yes, it's the oldest continuous parliament in the world, run by sheep rain and sheer collective memory. You attend a session. A man with a thick Manx accent and muddy boots recites old statutes. Another responds in rhyme. There's a lot of nodding, a few curses, and one very dramatic ruling about a stolen goat. It's glorious. Historians still argue whether these Norse traditions survived by accident or because islanders are just particularly good at ignoring royal decrees. You suspect it's both. And then there's Dublin. Yes, that Dublin. Founded by Vikings. At one point, the Norse called it Dyflin, and it was a major slave-trading hub, a political chess piece, and a cultural melting pot. By the 12th century, Dublin is no longer Viking in rule, but the bloodlines run deep. You visit a market where the stalls are stacked with silver jewelry shaped like longships, where merchants argue over coinage using terms from Old Norse like Erir and Mark. You peek into city records and see names like Thorkel Sigurd Harald, now softened to Twertelbach or Harold, but the roots still twitch when it rains. Quirky tidbit. In one 14th century Irish legal document, a man is fined for stealing a horse and referred to as a sea king's grandson. No one questions it. It just seems to explain his behavior. Back in the Orkneys, a storm rolls in. You sit with a fisherman who teaches you how to mend nets using knots passed down from Viking sailors. He jokes we've still got their weather, might as well keep their knots. The end of Norse rule comes not with fire and conquest, but with diplomacy. In 1468, the islands of Orkney and Shetland are pledged to Scotland as part of a dowry for a royal marriage. Norway can't pay the full amount, so it mortgages the islands, and then never gets them back. That's how Viking sovereignty ends in Britain with an unpaid bill. But as you ride a creaking cart past sheep and stone walls in Shetland, you hear old words. Bairn for child, Skadden for herring, Yule for Christmas. They're not just vocabulary, they're time travelers. The longships are long gone, but their descendants plant barley, mend fences, and tell ghost stories by the fire. They marry locals. They bury their dead in Christian graves with Thor's hammer tucked quietly beneath the linen. You spend your final night in a croft house warmed by peat and porridge. The wind moans outside, but inside the silence feels full. Not empty. You realize this truth: the Viking Age didn't end. It's simply settled. And in the places where the land is wildest, where the sea still whispers old songs, the Norse spirit lingers. Not in steel, but in memory. You're walking through a sleepy English village, not a Viking in sight, and yet the ghost of Norse Britain is everywhere. It's in the sign above the butcher's shop. His name is Thurgood. In the layout of the old farmsteads, and in the sound of a toddler shouting, "I" instead of "yes." It's the 15th century now. The medieval period is rolling toward its final act, and Viking Britain feels like a half-remembered dream. The battles have faded, the sagas are silent, and the ships are nothing but sea foam in the folk memory. And yet you carry them in your veins. In fact, if you've got English blood, especially from the north or east, there's a pretty decent chance you have Viking ancestors. The numbers are subtle, no glowing tattoos or inherited axes, but they're there. Genetic studies suggest that many people from places like Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and East Anglia carry higher percentages of Scandinavian DNA than other parts of Britain. You hear people joke that it's why the locals are good with tools and bad at suntanning. In York, once Jarvik, you can still walk streets mapped by Norse planners. The bones of Viking houses lie beneath the cobbles. You visit a cellar pub where they've preserved a bit of Viking wall behind glass. You sip your ale next to a 1,000-year-old post hole. You pass through the Jorvik Viking Center, a modern museum disguised as a ride through time. Animatronic traders shout in Old Norse. A robotic blacksmith hammers a horseshoe. The air smells suspiciously authentic peat smoke and rotting fish. You grin. Even history has a sense of smell. Then there's a language, that great cultural sponge. You notice that English has quietly stolen dozens of Norse words and just kept them. Sky egg, knife leg root window. Even everyday verbs like get, give, and take are Norse imports. A fringe tidbit. English is the only major European language where the third-person plural pronouns, they, them, there, aren't descended from Latin or Germanic roots, but are straight from Old Norse. You right now are thinking in Viking, and it goes deeper. You observe legal traditions that still echo Norse ideas of justice. Trial by jury, local councils. Even the stubborn English obsession with property boundaries might trace its lineage to Norse land laws and inheritance customs. Your neighbor's hedge dispute has deep, horned, helmeted roots. You pass a churchyard in the Danelaw and see a tombstone etched with a cross on one side and a serpent motif on the other. It's not a Viking grave. It's from the 17th century, but the style very familiar. You overhear a child telling a story about a sea giant who eats the moon. His mother tells him to hush, but later she admits her grandmother told her the same tale, only hers was about a wolf. You blink. That's Fenrir, the wolf of Ragnarok, still snarling in bedtime stories. In modern law, Danegeld has become a metaphor, a term for paying off a threat to go away. Politicians still use it. We must not pay the Danegeld someone declares in Parliament. The irony, they're saying it in a language shaped by the very people who once took that silver. In the Lake District, you meet hikers who refer to fells, becks, and tarns. All Norse words. The mountains haven't forgotten. Quirky fact. In 1965, in a Yorkshire peat bog, a farmer dug up a perfectly preserved Viking shoe. He took it home and used it as a change holder for 12 years before anyone realized it was 1,000 years old. It's now in a museum. The shoe, not the farmer. You walk along Hadrian's Wall, once the edge of Roman Britain, and hear schoolchildren giggle as they dress up as Vikings for a class photo. The boys want swords. The girls want braids and axes. You say nothing, you just smile. Because the Vikings are still here. Not on the coast with torches and longships, not in kingdoms and oaths, but in place names and accents and customs and cheekbones in every they that them ray their sentence ever uttered on this island. Viking Britain is no longer a battlefield. It's a memory palace with thatch roofs, dragon carvings, Sunday roasts, and the occasional ghost in the woods. Tomorrow the Tudors will rise. Gunpowder will echo. The modern world will shuffle forward, eyes full of invention. But tonight, under the mist, you can still feel it. A ripple in the ground, a shadow at the edge of the fire, a whisper in a language no longer spoken saying, "We are still part of you." You walk through a golden field in East Anglia as the sun sinks low, casting the long shadows of ancient hedgerows across the land. The wind rustles through barley, tugging softly at your sleeves like it wants to tell you something. And if you listen, really listen, you can almost hear them. Not voices, not words, but something deeper, something older. The quiet footprint of Viking Britain. It's the present day now. England is full of motorways, pints, and broadband internet. But underneath the new, the old persists not in museums alone, but in your language, your land, your law, and your life. You pass a road sign for Scunthorpe. It's easy to ignore, a town like any other. But you stop. You read it again. Thorpe Norse for village. 1,000-year-old etymological fossil sitting on a steel pole. And that's the magic. The Vikings didn't vanish, they melted in. Into the very structure of daily life. They taught English towns to build rows of houses facing the wind. They left their marks in coins, council boundaries, and the DNA of people walking to the pub. Some of their descendants still live in the same counties. Some crossed oceans, founding towns in Canada, the US, Australia, places with names like York, Norman, Harrogate. And while the myth of Vikings remains horned helmets, which they never wore, endless raiding, which was just part of the story, and burning monasteries. Okay, yes, that happened. Their real legacy is far subtler. It's in our fascination with freedom, with saga, with the sea. It's in every child who builds a cardboard longship, every dad joke about Danegeld, every rune tattoo scrawled by someone who's never been to Denmark. Historians still argue whether the Viking Age was an era of chaos or the beginning of something new. But here's what we know for certain. They changed Britain, not by conquering it completely, but by becoming part of it. And so you stand now on a hill, once watched by men with spears gazing across a landscape that holds centuries in its silence. The roads are paved now. The church is restored. The dragons of long ago now rest in flags and fairy tales. But if you find yourself near an old stone wall at dusk and the mist begins to rise, don't be surprised if you feel something stir. Something just at the edge of memory. And if you whisper Thor and feel the air shift, well, maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe someone's still listening. And now we ease out of the past. Let the rhythm slow. Let the sound soften. You're still on that hill. But the sun has set. The barley fields are silver under moonlight. A barn owl glides by in silence. A fox unseen watches from the hedgerow. The world turns slowly, quietly, just as it always has. In the village below, the houses glow warm through thick glass. You imagine someone tending a fire, someone brushing sleep from their eyes, someone humming a lullaby half remembered from a time when stories were sung in mead halls. The past is never far, but you are safe here in the now. You've journeyed far from the salt spray of Lindisfarne to the smoke-slick halls of Alfred, from the ash of Stamford Bridge to the quiet drift of Orkney memory. You've seen kings rise, ships burn, prayers change language. You've walked with ghosts and been one. So let it all settle. Let the waves fade. Let the swords lower. Let the torchlight dim. Tomorrow history will rise again. Full of questions, full of quarrels, full of wonder. But tonight, it rests, as you should. The pillow beneath you is firmer than a Viking cot. The blanket softer than a wool cloak. No sea to cross, no Donegal to pay, no oaths to swear. Just sleep. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.